Some time back, I had posted a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita on my Facebook site, and somebody commented that the Bhagavad Gita is the book that encourages violence and war the greatest. It is the best known for that, or something to that effect. So this indeed led me to address this issue. Because very, very unfortunately, most people have not read Bhagavad Gita. And even among those who have read Bhagavad Gita, in fact, I would say even among those who speak on Bhagavad Gita, this is my experience of simply observing. You want me to start again? Some time back, I had put a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, and one of the comments I received from the person who saw it on Facebook mentioned that the Bhagavad Gita is the greatest promoter of violence and war. And this saddened me because I realized, of course, that the person who wrote this has never read Bhagavad Gita entirely himself. And even more so, even those who are giving lectures on Bhagavad Gita, having read Bhagavad Gita, have not bothered to read Mahabharata. Of course, the original Mahabharata is a lot of reading. The edition by Ganguly, which I have, is 17 volumes. And when you read these 17 volumes, you are prepared to study Bhagavad Gita. Otherwise, you are not even prepared to study Bhagavad Gita. That's without guidance, of course. So the common belief is that the speaker of the Bhagavad Gita is encouraging Arjun towards violence and towards warfare. Well, this is very interesting because indeed all of us, we live in interesting times. And there is a common belief in current times that war is a terrible thing and should never be engaged in. But war has been there from time immemorial. And violence has also been there from time immemorial. And if you think that the problem today is the problem of violence and war, I must take you back to the days of the Bhagavad Gita, when the problem was not violence and war, but there was a lack of understanding what violence was for. There was a lack of understanding what war was meant for. And indeed, there was lack of will to engage in both violence and war, even when it was absolutely necessary. And because of this, Kings were laying down their arms and giving up their kingdoms. Armies and generals gave up the rule of protecting the nation, because India was infested, and I use the word infested. India was infested by salvation-centered, selfish, specific religions. That is, religions that focus not on society, but on one's individual selfish needs. And in seeking one's selfish needs, they forgot the purpose of maintaining society. All they were seeking was moksha. All they were seeking was liberation. And these religions, which demanded that you should give up your duties towards your society, that soldiers should lay down their arms, husbands should leave their wives and their family, children should leave their parents, and that all of them should become mendicants, renunciates, and roam around like parasites, going from village to village and town to town, living off those people whom they considered to be ignorant. This broad range of religions, which at that time were not really coalesced into anything specifically recognizable or identifiable, were called Shramana religions. And these Shramana religions used the philosophy of the law of karma. And after distorting and torturing and perverting this law of karma, they taught the conclusion that everything you do has a karmic impact on you. Therefore, do not even dig a well, because in digging a well, you will be harming creatures. How can you dig the fields and plow the fields? Because if you were to plow the fields, you will be killing more insects. In fact, if you breathe, you will be breathing in insects and destroying them. Therefore, wear a mask on your face all the time. As far as being soldiers, as far as policing the nation and protecting individuals from thieves and robbers and bandits, about protecting their nation from invaders who largely came from the northeast, northwest. That was horror of all horrors. How could you kill people even if they're about to kill you? Surrender yourself, let yourself be killed. And this poisonous philosophy, this perverted, poisonous philosophy, after distorting this law of karma, was what had polluted the minds of, specifically, of Arjuna. And Arjuna, the fine warrior that he was, being forced into battle Now please understand why the Battle of Kurukshetra took place. As I said, for that you have to read the Mahabharata in the original, then you will understand everything. But even if you don't read it in the original, this much you must know. That the Pandavas were tricked, thrown out of their kingdom, sent in exile for not one period of 14 years, but two periods. Again, as a result of being tricked. Efforts were made to kill them by burning them in a house of lacquer, by poisoning them. In various ways, every attempt was made to deprive them of life. And finally, when the time came for them to get their kingdom back, they refused, saying that we would rather kill you than give you back your kingdom. Even then, the Pandavas did not resort to violence. Even then, the Pandavas did not resort to violence. What did the Pandavas do? The Pandavas sent Arjun, and rather Arjun sent Krishna to be the mediator between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Because Krishna was universally respected by both the parties. So when Krishna came to meet the Kauravas, he told them that the path to salvation for all human beings lies in the performance of one's duties. This is very important. Yataha pravritte bhutanam yena sarvam idam tatam swakarmana abhyarchaya siddhim vindati manavaha. Every man in the performance of his God-given duty is born out of his inner nature, will attain salvation when he performs it as an offering to that all-pervading Lord, selflessly. So as Kshatriyas, their duty is to act as Kshatriyas. And what is the duty of a Kshatriya? In chapter 18, text 43, Krishna declares, Shauryam tejo dhritir daksham yuddhe chapya apalayanam danam ishvara bhavascha kshatram karma swabhavajam. Heroism, power, determination, skill and resourcefulness, courage in battle, never fleeing from the battlefield, generosity in giving alms and being generous in nature, wanting to dominate and to control due to their leadership qualities. These are the qualities of work for the Kshatriya. So therefore he said, if you cannot give them back their kingdom because you don't want to, the Pandavas don't want to fight. And I have proposed, that Krishna, God, has proposed, that the least you can do is to give each of them one village. If you give them one village, then each Pandava, as the ruler of that village, can perform his duties as Kshatriya in that village in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion to God, and thus he will attain salvation. They are asking for land or their kingdom, not for power, not for wealth, not for Aisharam, not for sense gratification, but they are asking for that at least one village each, so that they can perform their duties in a spirit of dedication and devotion to God, and thereby acting according to their prakriti as Kshatriya, they will attain salvation. So the purpose that Krishna asked Duryodhan, one village each, that is 5 villages, rather than the whole kingdom back or half the kingdom back, was so that the Pandavas would be able to pursue the justifiable spiritual duties. And Duryodhan told Krishna, I will not give the Pandavas as much land as fits on the head of a pin. And furthermore, they tried to arrest Krishna, who, using his mystic powers, enlarged himself and filled the assembly. And after frightening them for even daring to consider arresting him, came back to Arjuna and Yudhishthir and the Pandavas and told them there is no option. If you do not fight, these people will come and kill you, because they may be fighting to remove the irritation of having the Pandavas alive. You will be fighting for your life. So when is violence justified? When is war justified? Violence is justified for the protection of oneself and for the protection of others. So when you fight to protect yourself or when you fight to protect others, this is known as justifiable violence. And indeed, this was the cause of the war at Kurukshetra. So never imagine that Bhagavad Gita is about promoting violence. Here, violence is the last resort. When all negotiations have failed, when the other side does not even seek to try to understand what is the situation, forget about giving them their kingdom back, when the Kauravas are not even willing to give them as much land as there is on the head of a pin. And furthermore, they are coming to kill the Pandavas. Then violence is not only justified, it is also inevitable. And not to take up arms is an act of cowardice. These Shramana philosophies, which polluted the minds of Arjun by making him fearful. He was not fearful of the army. Although the armies of the Kauravas were 5 times the number of people who are on the side of the Pandavas, he was not afraid of the armies. He was a warrior, he was fearless. But he was defeated mentally by false philosophies. He was in fact destroyed by philosophy of adharma. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuttanam adharmasya tadatmanam srijami aham. When do I descend on this earth? I descend on this earth when there is a decline in dharma and a rise in adharma. And this salvation-centric, selfishly salvation-centric, non-violent to the extreme philosophy was adharma. Because polluted by this philosophy, kings were giving up kingdoms. Kings were giving up wars that were required to protect their people. And therefore, it became inevitable that either Kshatriyas be instructed to fight, being inspired by the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, or everyone should perish by following selfish, salvation-centric, non-violent religions. Non-violence is a virtue, but it is not the final virtue. Violence is also a virtue when it is used appropriately. Bhagavad Gita is not about non-violence. And all those who claim that Bhagavad Gita is about non-violence are the biggest fools that ever existed. Because Bhagavad Gita is clearly telling, Krishna is clearly telling Arjuna to fight the war of Kurukshetra. So clearly, it is about violence. It is about war. But it is about justifiable violence. It is about a justifiable war. And not only is it about a justifiable violence or that it is about justifiable war, it's important to understand that even as a surgeon, one needs to engage in violence. By profession, I am a surgeon. And a surgeon needs to cut off parts of the body when they are a danger to your life. The surgeon will remove your tonsils when they are purulent and causing you disease. A surgeon will remove your gangrenous appendix when it can cause your death. A surgeon will remove a limb when it has become infected and gangrenous and is going to cause septicemia and death. This is called surgical violence, where the violence is very precise. It is absolutely indicated. It is absolutely indicated. And failure to engage in that violence will lead to your death. Therefore, you should understand Therefore, you must understand that violence can be justifiable for the protection, for self-defense, and for the protection of others. And that violence should not be egregious violence. It should not be wanton violence. It must be surgical violence, which is precise, absolutely indicated, and where it does minimum damage, with minimum collateral damage. So Bhagavad Gita is about teaching Kshatriyas the path of performing their duty. Because unless somebody performs their duty, what happens to them? Especially if you are a Khatri, if you are a Kshatriya, not by jati, not by your birth, but by your gunas and your karmas, according to the inner qualities you possess and the profession that you practice. If you are indeed possessing the qualities of Shauryam Tejo Dhritir Daksham Yuddhe Chapyapalayanam Dhanam Ishvara Bhavascha Shatram Karma Swabhavajam. If you are filled with heroism, brilliance, determination, skillfulness, bravery, which does not allow you to withdraw from battle, never retreating, having generosity of spirit, having a dominant nature and qualities of leadership. If you have these qualities, you need to express them. You need to express them as a ruler, as a statesman. Today, there is no place for violence on the streets. No one should take violence into their own hands. Today, all violence has been outsourced to the state. So violence does not exist in a civilized person's life. Violence has been outsourced to the police force. Violence has been outsourced to the rapid action force. Violence has been outsourced to the commandos who protect us. Violence has been outsourced to the army that protects us. And therefore, those who possess the qualities of a Kshatriya should ideally engage in performing the duties of a Kshatriya by taking up those professions. Since violence has been assigned to the state, outsourced to the statesmen who command the armies are the real Kshatriyas. The soldiers are the real Kshatriyas. The police are the real Kshatriyas. And as Krishna warns Arjun, my dear Arjun, if you do not fight according to my direction in a dharmic battle, what dharmic battle? Where there is justifiable violence, where there is a justifiable war. As a soldier, which is your duty, if you do not act in this manner because of your ego, because of your confusion of philosophies of dharma, you will never be able to avoid violence, because for a Kshatriya, violence is ingrained in them, and sooner or later you will engage in warfare. So in 18.59, Krishna says to Arjun, Yad ahankaram ashritya na yotsya iti manyase mithyesa vyavasayaste prakritistvam niyokshati. If you do not act according to my directions and do not fight in this dharmic battle, then you will be falsely directed by adharmic philosophy. And by your nature, sooner or later you will be engaged in some battle which will not necessarily be dharmic or appropriate. So, therefore, it's important to understand that violence is outsourced to the state. It is conducted by soldiers and policemen and commandos. It is conducted by our armed forces to protect us from enemies within and without. And the commanders in chief, the statesmen who conduct and direct those armed forces, must be followed and obeyed. And indeed, that violence which the state uses, sometimes against another state, is done for the protection of its people. It is done for the protection of its people. Therefore, when it engages in violence, it is surgical violence. I think in India we're all familiar with the idea of surgical strike, because we perform precise violence, minimal violence, and effective violence for protection of the nation. But it is performed with minimum or no collateral damage to innocents around. So as I pointed out, Bhagavad Gita is not about somebody who wanted a kingdom and therefore was fighting. They were willing to compromise and accept one village each, just to perform their own duties as Kshatriyas, in a spirit of sacrifice and devotion to God, and thereby attain salvation. The dharmic way, not the adharmic way. But Arjun, whose mind was poisoned by adharmic philosophies, selfishly salvation-centric, non-violent philosophies, which would paralyze a society if they were followed, was confused by this adharmic philosophy. And Krishna appeared to teach him the principles of dharma. And the principles of dharma very clearly are that violence and war, which in modern day are outsourced to the statesmen and the army and the police, are used when justifiable to protect the nation and its people, and are performed with minimum damage to people other than those who are the danger and who are the cause of danger. So I will pause here. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.
Yes, sir. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question that we have is, in today's world, what can we practice instead of violence to fight for what we think is right?
See, for the common man, violence is not the way. Violence is the way of the warrior. Violence is the way of the soldier. Violence is the way of the police person. Violence is not the way of people who are living lives in a civilized country. You have no right to pick up your hand and strike your spouse or to strike your children. In fact, violence consists of many levels. There is what consists of physical violence, which we have been talking about. There is what we call as emotional violence, when people have been attacked emotionally. Then there is what we call as intellectual violence, when people want to learn, to study, and they are forbidden or prevented from doing so. That's called intellectual violence. And lastly, there is what we call as spiritual violence. That is preventing people from doing their duty, which is the primary means to attain God by offering all activities to Him in a spirit of love and devotion. So all forms of violence need to be avoided. And therefore, unless you are in the performance of your duty as a Kshatriya in the army, in the police, in the paramilitary forces, no one should engage in violence. But one should certainly apprise those Kshatriyas who are assigned to protect you, which means civilians will call the police. Those who are on the border and being assailed by army from the other side will call the army. Otherwise, there is no place for violence in our lives.
Yes, so thank you. The next question that we have is, often when we, raise our voice or kind of practice putting across your point in a non-violent way or an assertive way, especially in the corporate world, we are labeled as difficult and, not being in tandem with other people and not being flexible. What can we do in such a situation?
This is very simple. As long as you're in a job, you follow the hierarchy. If you don't agree with the hierarchy, don't fight with your superiors. Please take another job. I hope that is clear. I have already discussed the subject of anger in detail, which you can watch. And you should also understand that real communication should be based upon love. And that form of communication is called non-violent communication. Please look up the book on non-violent communication. And you will understand how to engage people in communication without disturbing their minds.
Thank you. So before we close the session, actually, I'd like to say that a lot of people have been suggesting topics for us, but we would request you, before you suggest the topics, is to go back to our video section on the Facebook page of Speaking Tree and look at the earlier videos. A lot of the topics that you're suggesting have already been covered. So please go through the sessions like Sir Right mentioned right now. Anger has been covered in detail. So please, of course, see those sessions. And of course, you're welcome to suggest new topics to us as well, and we will pick them up in the upcoming sessions. Thank you so much, Dr. Shantanu, for this week, and we'll see you.
Hari Om, Jai Shri
Hari Om.
Krishna, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.